The Washington Commanders! 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 I mean, I still get the giggles saying that name, hearing that name, looking at that name. It's dog shit. You think about the 32 teams in the NFL, legitimately, is there a worse team name than the Washington Commanders? I mean, they might as well have called themselves the Rear Admirals or something. Holy shit. But that name change just epitomizes this organization. Mediocre, laughable at times, and largely irrelevant. Not good enough to be a contender, not bad enough to, justify starting completely over, being in a position to get an elite quarterback prospect. All the while, they don't have that long-term quarterback answer on the roster. And that's the worst place you could possibly be, right? Right in the middle. Smack dab in the middle. And the Commanders are literally smack dab in the middle of the NFL last year. That's why they ended up with the 16th overall pick in round 1. And you got all of that mediocrity and all the just fuckery involved with Daniel Snyder's ownership of the team. And I don't care if you hate the Commanders. You have to feel good about the fact that Daniel Snyder is about to sell this team and will no longer be a blight on the organization or the National Football League as a whole. He is one of the worst, absolute worst owners in the history of North American professional sports. That's not recency bias. That is not hyperbole. That is reality. A bumbling fuck and a creep, a harasser, you name it. You can go on and on with Daniel Snyder. So this organization perhaps has some hope for the future just because they may get competent ownership, but if nothing else, they just get a fresh face in charge, right? And that in and of itself is going to make such a huge difference. Speaking of change, it's very possible another year or so the Commanders might be staring down the barrel of yet another name change. Like that, doesn't that represent the Commanders? So incompetent that they couldn't even lock down the trademark for their new team name. And instead of going with something like the Red Wolves, which would have been fucking awesome, it went with the Commanders, and they don't even own that fucking trademark. Oh my God. And now, speaking of kind of a joke city type of franchise, they're trying to sell themselves and their fan base on Sam Howell being the dude in 2023. And look, I think Sam Howell was underdrafted last year. He shouldn't have been a 5th-round pick. But he was ultimately a 5th-round pick. So to put that much hope in him being the guy feels like Riverboat Ron is trying to get his ass fired. It really does. It feels like people are just desperate and done. They're like, oh, the Carson Wentz shit didn't work out. Taylor Heineke, we know he's not going to be the dude. We got to roll the dice somewhere. But apparently, they have bought into this belief because they could have drafted Will Levis at 16, and they passed. They could have maybe even traded up for another quarterback in the top 4. They didn't. They passed. And it's clear, based off of where they took the guy, and when you see some of the behind-the-scenes war room footage for the draft, that the Commanders really valued Emmanuel Forbes at pick 16. And from a pure defensive standpoint, I get it. He brings some badly needed ball skills to a team that had 9 interceptions last year. They needed a playmaker in that secondary. Now, he's rail thin, and it makes you wonder how well he could hold up outside, or even how well he can hold up in the slot. You assume he gets to the league, gets into an NFL weight training program, makes a baby or two like a real star would, and he'll get up to like 180, 185, 190 pounds. They put on that man weight pretty quickly, you would hope. But it is interesting that you going with Sam Howell and your first pick is on the defensive side of the ball. Interesting is what I would say there. Interesting. Now, you could sit there and say, well, you've still got 2 more days of the draft, and maybe you really like the talent there in Emmanuel Forbes, and it's hard to pass it up. I get that. But then you start off day 2 by double dipping into the corner pool, and you go after Quan Martin from Illinois. I think he could be a versatile starting slot corner. Maybe you play him in some like nickel dime safety as well. But again, I come back to, for this Commanders team, you're going into the season with a 5th-round pick as your starting quarterback. You spend your first 2 picks on the defensive side of the ball. That doesn't really compute. How in the fuck do those 2 defensive backs really help Sam Howell? I mean, seriously. Seriously. How? I'd love to know. And, you know, you could say they salvaged it a little bit by taking Stromberg in round 3. And, you know, I like that pick. And he certainly has a chance to be their starting center, I think, even this year. But through 2 days of the draft, 2 defensive backs and a center. You know, for a team that could certainly use help at tight end and a really, really good tight end class, to not spend a pick on tight end in the first 2 days felt pretty dumb. It really, really did. And for a team that could have used more offensive line help, you know, they were in position to draft offensive linemen in the first 2 days, and they drafted 1. Interesting, to say the least. Now, on day 3, they came back, and they took Braeden Daniels. He's got the athleticism to play offensive tackle. He needs size and strength. No big deal, right? But type of guy early in day 3 that you take because he's got the athletic upside, you gamble on that. KJ Henry could come in and contribute as a rotational edge rusher, I think, right away. He's got some burst. Chris Rodriguez Jr. from Kentucky, I think he's, you know, your running back 3 type of guy. He'd come in and spell Robinson, come in and spell Gibson. You know, how much he gets on the field might be determined by how much he could contribute on special teams. And I think Andre Jones has probably just practice squad potential, and that's about it. So even when you look at day 3, you're like, yeah, they invested in an offensive tackle and a running back. So at least there was a little more investment in the offense. But to me, it's one thing to not have taken a quarterback early in this draft of your Commanders. And there could be like a deep down hope of, hey, if Sam Howell sucks, that means this team is really going to suck, which means you can get rid of Riverboat Ron in this tank year of 2023, and you could go after a Caleb Williams, a Drake May, one of those quarterbacks in next year's draft. And that might be deep down the in private behind the scenes, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, real plan here. It is incredibly risky to say we're going to throw our eggs into the Sam Howell basket. And that's what they're doing here. If you're going to do that, though, I would think you want to do everything you can to make sure that he succeeds. To come out of this draft without a tight end, you know, you could have dipped in and tried to find another slot receiver, some more offensive line depth early on. I just wasn't a fan of the approach of the Commanders here. I think you got a couple of good players, but it's not always just about getting good players. It's about philosophy and strategy and approach and execution. I thought the Commanders draft left a little bit to be desired.